Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reentry, a parenting conference for navigating the post-pandemic new normal. I'm Maggie Macaulay, and I'm very excited to be your host today. I serve as the executive director of the Peaceful Project, the owner of Wholehearted Parenting, and the parenting columnist for the Santa Fe New Mexican. The Peaceful Project, Wholehearted Parenting, and the Santa Fe New Mexican are bringing you this conference today. We are extremely grateful to the New Mexico Early Childhood and Care Department for sponsoring the conference, along with Rogoff Dental Group here in Santa Fe. We could not have done it without these two organizations. The Peaceful Project provides incredible social emotional learning programs for young people from second grade on up. Wholehearted Parenting provides online and live programs as well as coaching for parents, individuals, and organizations. The Santa Fe New Mexican, one of the oldest newspapers in the West, provides you with national and local news, along with a great parenting column. Your program has information about each of your speakers, as well as the hosts and sponsors. There are links to their websites and podcasts so that you can stay in touch and enjoy the resources that they offer. There's a lot of room in your program for you to take down concepts that you would like to remember, important takeaways, and things that you find interesting. If you don't have your program, simply have a pen and paper handy. You can also email me if you would like me to send you a program. I'm happy to do that. Things have really shifted since we first began developing Reentry. The pandemic is not gone. We are not in a post-pandemic world. We have not welcomed a new normal. Yet everything that you hear today will support you right where you are right now, as well as where you will be in the months to come. So let's begin. Please welcome Micah Barber, who is speaking about navigating COVID-related grief with our kids.
Thank you, Maggie. I'm incredibly honored to be following Dr. Lisa D'Amour today, and I'm honored to be here today speaking with you about grief. I'd like to talk to you today about what grief is, about how it's shown up for us and for our kids in the last year and a half due to COVID and the global pandemic. And then I'd also like to give you some tips as parents about what we can do to support our kids in grief. So first of all, what do you think about when you hear the word grief? What comes to mind? Most people say either death or divorce. And I'd like to just take a moment and send my heartfelt condolences to anyone who has lost someone in the last year and a half due to COVID and the global pandemic. And death and divorce are definitely things that are related to grief. But there's also many other losses related to grief. And in this work, there's over 40 losses defined that can cause a person to grieve. First, I want to give you a definition of grief. So if you're taking notes, this is a great thing to write down. Grief is the natural and normal reaction to loss of any kind. And in those 40 losses that I mentioned, there's both primary and secondary losses. So primary losses are things that are tangible, things like the loss of a loved one, the loss of a relationship, moving, the loss of a job. The primary losses are things that are very tangible. So it's something that was there, and then it's the absence of that thing. They're easy to identify. But along with the primary losses come secondary losses. The secondary losses are intangible things, and they're harder to identify. So some examples of secondary losses are things like the loss of trust, or the loss of our sense of security, or the loss of a sense of safety. So I want to give you some examples that are related to COVID and the pandemic, things that our kids have experienced over the last year and a half. So the primary losses are things like the loss of routine of going to school, or the loss of our routine with our kids participating in sports, their hobbies, their passions, their activities that they are used to attending, the loss of those things, the loss of social connection and social gathering. Those are the primary losses. And of course, if you lost a loved one, but the secondary losses that came along with the pandemic are just abundant. There's almost too many to list. And those are things like the loss of our sense of certainty in the world, that we had maybe a sense of control or a sense of certainty about how the world, was going to go for us. Our loss of trust in again, our sense of certainty, but there's sort of a sense of loss of trust. Maybe our loss of safety or a loss of security. Perhaps our kids lost their sense of belonging as they had to disconnect from all of these familiar patterns. And so it's just important to know that both the primary and secondary losses that came along with COVID are extensive. I want to expand the definition of grief that I gave you. And this is another good thing to write down if you're someone taking notes. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by an end or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So let me say it again. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So let's dissect that definition for just a minute. If we're looking at it just as if grief is caused by a change in a familiar pattern of behavior, we can see that there has been so much change in the last year and a half, right? I mean, the whole world has changed as we know it, and so many of our familiar patterns of behavior have changed. The next thing in that definition that's important is the word conflicting. So grief is often a mixed bag of emotions, and that's what can make grief hard to identify and also hard to work through. So I want to give you some examples related to COVID and the pandemic, and as everything was changing for our kids. When our country specifically went into lockdown, and many of our kids were sent home from school. For many kids, that may have been exciting even, right? School's canceled. This is sort of a good thing. I'm sure many kids felt that way. We get to sleep in, we maybe get to wear our pajamas all day. There could have been some excitement around that. In addition, they were losing social connection to their friends, their connection to their sports and activities and organizations that they belong to. And so there was conflicting feelings. On one hand, they're feeling excited. On the other hand, they're feeling the disappointment and the sadness of everything changing. Another example, I think that many people I know felt some relief in this great pause that was happening in the world. Of course, if you were a frontline worker or an essential worker, anyone in the medical field was probably not feeling that. But for some people, there was this great pause that was happening. Everyone was sent home. We're now, at home with our families. Many of our social obligations in the world came to a halt. And for some people, that felt like relief. At the same time, we're feeling angst and anxious about this virus that's circulating in the world. And our kids were feeling anxious about that. Maybe we have grandparents who were at great risk, aging parents, or we have a family member who has an underlying health condition who was also at risk. And so again, we're feeling this conflicting emotion. We're feeling maybe some relief about some parts of this, and then we're feeling a lot of angst and anxiety. And it's often how grief is created, and it's often a important symptom of grief. Is the confliction of feeling. So what's important to know about grief is that it is an incredibly overlooked and neglected process in our culture and in many cultures. And there's a lot of misconception around grief. And there's some myths that we perpetuate for each other, and oftentimes we perpetuate for our kids. So I want to touch on a few of the myths. The first one I want to mention is something I know we've all heard, and that is that time heals all wounds. And I know we've heard this, right? Things get better with time. Time heals all. Time will heal. Time will make things better. And it just isn't. It isn't true. It simply isn't true. And time alone will not heal. Being an active participant in our healing and in our grief will help us heal through grief, but time alone will not heal. A lot of times we suppress, or if we're harboring feelings around grief, over time, those things just fester, and then they come out in destructive ways or in unhealthy behaviors. So that's an important myth to look out for. Another one that we hear a lot is to stay strong. When we're facing adversity in our life, we often hear this, or we tell each other this, right? To just stay strong, be strong for others. And I think as parents, we definitely take that on. We have to be strong for our kids. But the term stay strong to me is just another way of saying stay stuck in your emotion. It's a way that we disconnect from what we're really feeling. It's a way that we sort of armor up and withstand whatever life's throwing at us in a way that we just, sort of white knuckle our way through without really feeling what's happening inside. Another one that we perpetuate often, accidentally, as parents to our kids is the idea that we must grieve alone. And here's how we perpetuate this. As parents, we often feel that if we're emotional, right? If we're upset, if we're crying, if we're worried, then it's something we should not do in front of our kids. We should go behind closed doors. We should wait till they're not around, and we should navigate those emotions alone. And so when our kids don't see us in our emotion, then we're sending an indirect message to them that they have to deal with their emotions alone as well. So it's another important myth around grief. I want to give you a visual. Imagine a tea kettle on a hot stove. So there's a hot flame underneath this tea kettle, okay? And as the water boils, there's a certain amount of steam generated. And typically the steam would escape a little bit at a time through the spout. And it would even whistle, right? And alert us and notify us that the water was boiling. Now I want you to imagine a cork. And the cork represents the myths around grief and the misconceptions in our culture around grief. And imagine sticking that cork in the spout of the tea kettle. So what's going to happen to the steam? Where is it going to go? Okay, this is an important thing to be aware of. And I want to introduce you to a concept. This is another important thing for note takers. The concept of STIRBs. So STIRB is an acronym, and it stands for short-term energy relieving behavior. Okay, so STIRB, short-term energy relieving behavior. And what happens to that tea kettle and that steam inside when we cork it is that steam and that energy has to go somewhere. And this is where STIRBs come in. And these are ways that we disconnect from the feelings inside, and that we find ways to relieve some of that pressure and that tension. But it's a short-term solution to a long-term problem. We're not getting to the root of the problem when we participate in a STIRB. So what is a STIRB? A STIRB is something that disconnects us from our emotions. So it can be something like excessively scrolling social media, Netflix binging. It can be overeating. It can be exercising. It can be working, gambling, drugs and alcohol, shopping. We call that retail therapy, right? And some of these things are essential, and we all participate in these things, but it's when we're participating in them in an obsessive or excessive way to disconnect from our emotions. So it's an important thing to look out for as a parent with your child. So now that I think we can agree that we are in collective grief, that our world is in a collective grieving period, and our kids on some level are likely grieving. Okay, so what do we do about that as parents? Well, first of all, don't panic, okay? Because Grief is a part of life. If there is life, there is grief. If there is love, there is grief. And we know that this may not be the first time your child has been grieving, but definitely it is not the last, because grief is a part of life. And so I see this as an opportunity. I really see this as an opportunity for us as parents to teach our children some amazing skills and give them some tools to navigate grief. So what can we do? The first thing is acknowledge and recognize that we are in grief and that our kids are in grief. An incredible brain scientist and mentor of mine, Daniel Siegel, he's an author and a very well-known author and a brain researcher, has a simple phrase that is so powerful. He says, name it to tame it. And once we can identify and name what's happening inside us, so much of the power dissipates. And it's a powerful tool to use with our kids. So if we can help them recognize that there is grief and that we are all in a collective grief, that is the first step. The second thing is go first, okay? Be emotionally honest with your children about what you're grieving, about how you're feeling. Share with them the things you're missing about, pre-COVID life. Share with them the things that are pulling on your heartstrings. Be emotionally honest with them. It gives them permission to be emotionally honest, first with themselves, but then also with you. And don't let them grieve alone, right? So share the emotional honesty of the situation with each other. And another quote that I love comes from Gabor Mate. He's a trauma specialist, and he says, children are not traumatized by things that hurt them. They're traumatized when they're left alone with those hurtful feelings. So don't let your kids grieve alone. The next thing I want to say is that don't perpetuate the myths, right? Don't perpetuate those things about the misconceptions in our culture around grief. And finally, I just want to end with my favorite quote about grief. Comes from an author, David Kessler, who wrote a book called Finding Meaning. And he says, our grief doesn't get smaller, we get bigger. And I think this is the most poignant thing I've ever heard about grief, because it's true. Grief gives us the opportunity to expand around the discomfort of our feelings. And I think this time is a time of expansion, not only for us, but for our children. And so we can expand our capability to hold our emotion. And it gives us a broader range and a broader depth of emotional capacity. So I want to leave you with that. If there's anyone that wants to go deeper into grief, into studying grief, I have some courses coming up this fall, both for adults and working through their personal grief, and then for adults who want to help the children in their care around grief. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Micah. I love the idea of noticing our children's emotional energy, as well as knowing that our kids need our help in being in grief. The idea that our grief doesn't get smaller, that we get bigger, is powerful and encouraging. I personally know of no one more attuned to speak about resilience and trauma than Morgan Lindsay, who is soon to be Dr. Morgan Lindsay. She pre-recorded this interview because she is tapping into her own resilience right now, braving the wilds of Alaska. Please welcome Morgan as she speaks about understanding resilience, U-turn to return.
Hi everyone, my name is Morgan. I am coming to you today, not on a live talk, but on a recorded talk from Alaska. I'm currently sitting in Anchorage between a couple of trips that I've been taking out in national parks here. I'm a 37-year-old psychotherapist based in Austin, Texas, and I was invited to speak to you today about trauma. The truth is, I can't speak to you about trauma without also talking to you about resilience. My hope and longing is that you can take value from what I say and weave it into your own life and into your own wisdom as a parent and as a human being, and live an even higher quality of life, connection, love, and support. I hope this information brings you an opportunity to deepen your relationships and get more of the connection and love and satisfaction that you want. I often joke that my family was my first internship in personal growth and development. When I was 11 years old, I started reading parenting books, and as I began consuming books about parenting, I had hopes of helping my parents become better parents. It turns out you can't treat your own family, but the field of psychotherapy already knew this. I still like to think that somehow I broke through, and certainly I learned tools and different pieces along the way that helped me grow up and grow along my journey. The good news is that there's lots of opportunities to grow. The bad news, or maybe the news that doesn't get printed on most brochures, is that healing is a lifelong journey. There's several opportunities to upgrade your life along the way, but as I talk to you about trauma today, I want to invite you to keep in mind that healing is something that we do over the course of a lifetime, hopefully with several upgrades along the way. And my hope is that by the end of this talk, you not only feel a sense of upgrade, but you have tools that you can use to upgrade your own life as you address the challenges that re-entry may bring. So as I begin, let's get on the same page about what trauma is. There are a few ways to define trauma, but it's best understood as an overwhelming event or one that alters the way we process and recall memories, and it can even dictate and imprint our future decisions. Most simply put, trauma blocks love. Common side effects of trauma are shame, emotional withdrawal, isolation, and those things can make us feel alone and trapped, even powerless. More simply put, and how I think about trauma is that trauma can be the belief that what was is what will always be. So let me say that again. Trauma can be the belief that what was, what did happen, is what will always be and what will always play out. And healing is understanding that what was is not what will always be. And as cheesy as it sounds, love heals trauma. And as simple as it sounds, trauma blocks love. I also believe and have experienced in my own life that trauma can open a door to growth and resilience. Resilience is our ability to bounce back again and again from each and every obstacle we face. It's our capacity to adapt. Resilience is not inherent, but it is something that we develop over time. And in my opinion, and in my research, it's clear to me that we help each other develop resilience. We don't do this alone. So let me tell you a story about a recent experience I had in the wilderness, and it's got ties all the way back into my own life as a high schooler. When I was 16 years old in high school, I was in some ways forced by my parents to go on a backpacking trip in Colorado with a group of teenagers. And what I didn't know going into that group as a 16-year-old was that the group of kids I was entering had already known each other for several years, and I was just meeting them for the first time. I was an introverted kid. I wasn't super confident. I didn't feel super comfortable in my own skin, and I had no idea what I had gotten into. And as I entered that trip, which was a week-long trip through the wilderness, I experienced a really isolating week. I was in some ways left out and maybe potentially bullied by some of the kids I was around, and I struggled the entire time I was there. I remember wanting to just call my parents and beg to come home every single day. And this was before there were cell phones and before there was an opportunity to do that. So I felt a little shaky earlier this month when I entered the wilderness for the second time in my life as a backpacker with a group of friends that I did know well. And even though this was a different group of friends and a different experience, even from the very beginning, I felt nervous and like I didn't even want to go. I love nature, I love the wilderness, but something inside of me was really resisting the experience. I was in unfamiliar territory. I was afraid of disappointing people. I was afraid of the unknown. We were being guided through the wilderness by a guide who knew our route, so we were not necessarily in charge of that. And as I strapped my 50-pound backpack to my back and started hiking, I remember feeling incredibly afraid. The truth is, my inner child was out and my inner adult was totally gone for a little while. And I was reminded of how quickly trauma can take over. There was really no immediate threat or no immediate danger, but I was already playing out stories of how I was going to be left out and alone and not fit in. And the funny thing is, when I talked to people or when I tried to share with them how I was feeling, they didn't totally get it and they mostly wanted to fix it. And while that was nice, I was tracking my own experience and noticing how it wasn't that relieving to me. Even in certain moments, I wanted to turn back and wished I could go home. But as I started to step into the experience and as I started to advocate for myself more and more, what I started to realize what a lot of my fears were fears that were living in my own mind and weren't actually playing out in reality. And the more that people were able to validate my feelings and the more I was able to validate my own feelings, the more centered I began to feel as I went through my week and my time in the wilderness. So I want to talk to you as I continue telling this story about what it might look or feel like to have what I would call a courageous conversation with your family, with you as parents, as partners, or with you and your kids that can yield an opening for a new experience. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's really hard to talk people out of their feelings. And so I don't recommend going down that path, but that doesn't leave us with a lot of tools. So I want to invite you to consider a really simple process that will help you unravel the fears that you or your children might have about re-entering your school experiences or your family experiences or your social experiences this next year. So it's a myth that we can sometimes not even realize we buy into, that in order to feel better, we need our external circumstance to change. In other words, we need something outside of us to change to make our insides feel better. So as we acknowledge that that's a myth, then we can enter a conversation where we begin the process of turning towards our feelings and our emotions. What that means is we make space to acknowledge how we feel, what our thoughts and judgments are, and what our beliefs are. Acknowledging and validating is different than fixing, and that can be hard to remember. So I'm going to say it again. Acknowledging and validating our fears is different than trying to fix something. So it can be helpful to turn towards what your own fears are and talk about them. And if we had more time, I would have you do an exercise with each other where all you did was listen to each other's feelings and notice how many different parts of you might want to try and fix that. It's human, it makes sense. Of course, we want to take each other's pain away, but a part of healing trauma and building resilience is finding the capacity to witness both our challenges and our successes. So step one is turning towards our feelings and our emotions, turning towards our thoughts and our judgments, and turning towards our beliefs. When I put my 50-pound backpack on this last week, I did not believe I would be able to walk 45 miles up and down mountains without trails on them for 8 days. I felt small and out of place, a little bit scared, and I judged myself as being literally the slowest person in our group, and I had a belief that that was not okay. Right? So being able to hear that from each other creates space to begin to have a new experience. It literally calms our brain down. The second thing that we can do for each other is validate. Validate is offering phrases that sound or look like, "It makes sense to me that you would feel that way," or "Based on what your experience is or has been, it makes sense to me that you feel concerned." Sometimes when the little people in our life, the young people, feel concerned, or even our own friends and family members, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying like, "Oh, that's not a fear that's gonna play out." And that might be right, but the better thing and the more calming thing we can do for each other is say like, "Gosh, I totally understand why you would feel afraid of that." Or if we can't understand, to get curious and ask questions about that. Right? So this is what I would call a U-turn. That we take a turn towards our own curiosity, our own thoughts and feelings, share them and get to know them better, as opposed to doing what is sometimes a lot more comfortable and in terms of trying to fix or convince someone to feel something else. As we validate what we say, it brings a sense of calm to our nervous system. It helps us feel like we don't have to run away. It helps us feel like we don't have a sense of threat that we need to fight. And it gives us an opportunity to return to relationship with a more holistic approach. The shadow side of not doing this is that sometimes we can return to a relationship hoping to convince someone to see the world the way we see it. What we want to do when we're going to honor or acknowledge overwhelm or something that's been challenging, or if we want to build resilience, is we want to return in a way where we can understand and see and get each other's experience. So after you turn towards your feelings and emotions, and after you validate what is going on inside of you, it offers you an opportunity to then return to what's going on that you're wanting to clear out. Right? So after I was able to turn towards my own fears and pay attention to what my beliefs actually were without trying to talk myself out of them, then I could return to my group. I could be curious. I could connect. I could stay a little bit more calm. I could voice what I wanted, and I could get conversations to help me feel understood instead of trying to solve a problem. And that offers a sense of what's called regulation, which is a way where we can start to hold on to our feelings and hold on to ourselves without feeling overwhelmed, and also without exiling or cutting off a vulnerable feeling. Right? So this is something that we do for ourselves, and it's also something that we do for each other. I think this matters a lot in the world of re-entering things after the pandemic. I think we have our own fears as adults that we're dealing with, and we also want to get regulated enough internally that we can hold some space for the younger people in our lives to feel a sense of being heard, being witnessed, and having a sense of regulation as well. It means that we have to take an inner journey at the same time, or close to the same time, that we get to know what's going on with our kids. And then part of the return in this courageous conversation is not changing the situation, but it's actually asking questions like, if there was a way that you could do that thing you want to do without feeling so afraid, what would it look like? And we can start to really hear each other. I got a lot of help as I traveled through the wilderness because I was willing to ask questions, because I was willing to get help being heard, and because I myself was able to hear and validate my own feelings, even if they weren't reasonable. Right? And that was not something that I experienced as a kid. As a kid, I felt bullied. As a kid, I felt scared. And as a kid, I didn't have the tools to articulate any of those feelings. hopefully you're not going backpacking in the wilderness as you re-enter the world and try to navigate all these things in a way where it would make it difficult for you to have these kinds of conversations. But what I do want to invite you to consider is that this is something that's very simple. It's actually not that complicated, but it can feel complicated because it can feel threatening to slow down without fixing. Trauma, or moments in our lives where we feel overwhelmed, are actually a door to growth and resilience that are trying to open. And we can help each other through those moments by being curious, by turning towards our own inner experience and sharing that with one another, by validating our own experience and sharing that sense of validation with one another, by having enough courage to trust that a new resolution will surface if we are willing to hear each other out, because the truth is, a lot of times the resolution we're looking for is just an opportunity to feel safe together. And then we can return to what is being invited forward, and we can offer each other a sense of curiosity, a sense of connection, a sense of calm, and a sense of regulation in that process. We don't feel just one feeling. We feel multiple feelings at the same time, and this is a way of beginning to make space for that. Part of what makes trauma is that when we feel overwhelmed, we end up splitting ourselves off as we try to get through an experience. Part of what heals trauma is that we offer each other a holistic space to be witnessed, validated, and listened to. And when we can do that, we can bring more and more peace and calm into our lives while still facing all of the things that matter to us and navigating those in ways that make the most sense, right? Just holding a more holistic sense of understanding. So whether you're a beginner in unfamiliar territory, entering a new school, a new school year, a new way of being, or if you're afraid of disappointing people, or if you're afraid of the unknown, I invite you to turn towards a friend or a loved one, or start a conversation with your kids, and create a space where you can share both what you feel challenged by and what you feel grateful for, and build on that. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of your conference. If you want to learn more about the work I do or what I offer, you can contact me through the contact page on my website, www.morganlindsay.org. And I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Having concrete tools like the 4 steps is incredibly helpful. Morgan is right now above the Arctic Circle. Let's wish her well in her adventures. High school football and basketball coaches are extremely busy people, and I'm grateful for the time Coach William Moon and Coach Roy Sanchez devoted to this interview that you're about to see. In the discussion, we dive into what it was like for high school athletes and high school athletics when COVID hit. We talk about what everyone learned, what to expect as school begins again, and the true purpose of high school athletics. A big thanks to Coach Moon, formerly of Capitol High and now with the Santa Fe Indian School, and to Coach Sanchez of El Dorado High School in Albuquerque.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. So what we're talking about today, Coach Moon, is the impact of the pandemic on athletes, high school athletes, and high school athletics. So how would you like to start off that conversation?
Well, in many respects, as you're laying it out there, it just struck me that there's Dickens. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And I don't think most people would have looked at it that way. Yeah. We all know what the worst of times are, 600,000 people. Yeah. When COVID hit, we had a team at Capitol of 63 players, and very shortly we had a team of about 30. And because kids quit and had to go work for the family, had to go make some money, had to help support their family, and that was a terrible blow to their aspirations and goals and the joy of being a teenager. But on the other side, for 15 months, there was no hope. We were all, as a country, going through horrible times, the worst of times. And of course, when you consider world wars and whatever, not really the worst of times, but it was just tough times. So I don't want to get too carried away with that one. But the team, we kept trying to keep the team focused on the future. You know, it's bad times. You're always going to have bad times, like walking through a snowstorm in Chicago. You know, sooner or later you're going to get inside the building and be okay. And that's what we kept trying to sell. And the kids accepted it. They stayed together as a team. Even the kids that couldn't continue to play stayed connected to the team. And the team kept moving forward, and we kept looking for the horizon. And
Right.
if you have a goal, you can go forward.
I mean, that's a big question. There's so many things going on, you know, with COVID, and hopefully we're done with it. But I mean, we can talk forever probably on how it impacted the athletes, the coaches, the school, the community, just everything. It's, again, hopefully we're done with that. You know, I mean, we had to adjust as we go. Just every day there was something new. As an athletic director, I was constantly emailing our coaches. Okay, you can do this, but you can't do that. Now this has changed. Now you can work with 9 athletes. Nope, now you can only work with 4 athletes at a time. Just so much.
Were you able to practice in small groups, or how did that look? What did your athletes experience over the last 19 months or during this last school year? Were they able to do some things together?
Yes, but when it first started, you know, nothing. I mean, in March of last year of 2020, it was just such a shock. Nothing could be done. We weren't going to school. I couldn't believe it at the time. I couldn't believe, hey, they're just going to shut down school for the rest of the year.
Right.
And sure enough, yes, they did. You know, the spring sports were started. Baseball and softball had started playing a few games. I remember walking up to the softball field while they were waiting on umpires, and I said, "This game's not going to be played. Sorry, girls. A team for games and no more." Track was just going to be started that weekend with some track and field events. All that got canceled. We didn't know when we were going to come back. You know, as we went, the governor shut everything down. Schools were shut down, so nothing. You know, and then. You know, then the summer came and went, and we weren't able to do anything with our athletes. We were hoping football season would have started, but nothing, you know, in August and September. And then as we went forward, we were just hoping things would go. And then they allowed us to work with 9 athletes at a time, 1 coach per 9 athletes. So football got 2 or 3 coaches, you know, you could work with about 27 kids. So they'd have to rotate every hour, then a new 27 kids would come in.
What would you say to parents and their student athletes coming back into the 2021, 2022, and those don't even sound like real years, coming back into the new school year? What's athletics going to look like? What can students expect? What are you hoping for in this new school year that's coming up?
I always hope for a pot of gold, and I'm still looking. But I think what we have to expect is a surge of getting back together. We were talking a moment ago, this is the first time we've done anything like this in a long time.
Absolutely.
And this particularly is a joy to be doing. But I think the kids have to understand that there's joy in front of them. All right. Mm-hmm. Okay. But is it ever going to be the same? It'll never be the same, right, because we will always have the collective memory. And at the same time, there has to be some anxiety and some caution with this variant spreading. Mm-hmm. We could go right back to where we were. And so the lessons that we have learned through the bad times we've come through may have to be reapplied.
Right. How did your athletes handle all this?
They were at times frustrated. You know, they wanted to get with teams and they wanted to work together and with the whole groups and stuff like that. I mean, after a while, they were pretty resilient, okay, and as we went, we were trying to be positive. Hey, there is going to be a season. We are going to play. But as they went, it's like, wow, I don't think there is going to be a season.
Yeah.
I don't think we are going to play. Then it got reduced to 4 athletes per 1 coach. So he really had to be creative.
Yeah.
In football, you have 11 players. In soccer, you have 11 players. So you can only work with half of your offense or half of your defense or whatever. Even in basketball, 4 athletes and 1 coach. So 1 coach had to be, you need 5 for basketball. So 1 coach had to be one of the players in the mix. So, we were adapting to situations and things and trying to make them believe we were going to have a season, but it was tough. It was difficult.
So, is there anything that you would say to students who are getting ready to come back to school about resilience, how to prepare themselves for the new school year, what they can expect in coming back, and say a few things, if you would, about college recruitment and some of the losses that they may have had over the last year? I know that evolved into a pretty big question.
Yeah. Well,
So break it down however you would like.
as most people who are getting interviewed, they like to start with the last part of your question and then work back to the front, because
That's perfect.
last part's easiest, the one to get to. We had 7 kids on our team who we thought could be college players, and they had every reason to believe they could go on to college and play. But as we were only one of 3 states in the nation that didn't play in the fall, and as Coach Sanchez has already pointed out, college kids got an extra year. So not only were there fewer openings at the college level, there were fewer job openings. Just think of it as a job. They were looking for fewer players. And our 7 kids were going to play high school football in the spring. As a college coach who's trying to feed my family and advance my career, I'm not waiting for the state's leading rusher, Luke Padilla, to come. He's going to play and he might get hurt in the spring. I'm going to take the second best kid, fill the slot with a known variable, and that kid comes onto my campus and we're going to get started. So we had 2 kids out of the 7 get placed, all right? Mm-hmm. It was a terrible thing. Colleges couldn't come to the campus to see the kid. And coaching is such a personal thing. I mean, it really is. It's a tactile thing. It's a personal thing. That's why the kid who's 40 years old comes back to coach and tells him what happened.
That's a great story.
It is a great story. And, I'm coaching children of my players, all right? So it's really personal and it lasts a long time. And if you don't have that personal connection as a recruiting coach, it's difficult for you, all right? What can the kids expect this year? On the one hand, they can expect a return to normalcy, to borrow whoever it was that, I forget what president brought us that one, and we didn't get back to normal then either. But we have to be cautious about how we go about doing it.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your experience, what you see coming up, anything you think parents or students need to know, anything we may not have covered?
I think they just really have to be they have to adapt to things, moving forward. Things change so quick. The world changed so quick.
Yeah.
Yes, be just enjoy it. Just enjoy it instead of, worrying about this and worrying about that. Just enjoy life. Just enjoy what you have. You have your parents, you have your family, you have, hopefully everyone came out of this safe in their life, and they know, a lot of cases they didn't. So what you have, enjoy what you have and appreciate what you have. Appreciate there's people for you. Your parents are there for you. Your teachers, your coaches are there for you. And hopefully you can be successful. That's what our goal is anyway. Having all these athletes, go on and be successful. And whatever that is, whatever successful means, whatever they want to do, whether, again, it's a military or go to college or go in the workforce, be successful. Be a good kid for your parents. That's what we're all trying to sort of strive for.
So, Coach, when you were talking about the joy that students are going to experience, student athletes coming back and being able to practice together, play together, train together, will you go into what you see as the purpose of athletics in high school and the benefits for students?
No question. It's funny when you pose the question, coming back and training and the joy to be together and nobody likes to train, but it was the word you used repeatedly: together, together, and together. Again, we're social animals. We find joy in it. We may not be consciously aware of it, or we may be reluctant to admit it, but being together is the joy of it. And we try and teach, we say in athletics, I know I do, and my coaches do, how do we work together with one another? I've had a team where a member of the Ku Klux Klan's son was on it, and a black kid was on it, and they played next to each other. I've had a team where a Serbian kid and a Croatian kid stood right next to each other at the height of their war back in Europe. I've had a team where, all different kinds of people have come together. And if you can get people together, we're not such a bad creature. And so I think in football you try and teach people to set aside the unimportant and focus on the important. Who are you? Now, what do you look like? Not how do you talk, not what your accent is or your religion is, but who are you? Those are all parts of it, but they're facets of a diamond, and we know that a diamond is more than one facet. All right? So in high school, you try and teach, let's all different people come together. I remember the first time after Title IX was passed, a young woman came out for football, and one of my guys came up and says, "You're going to let a girl play football?" And I said, "If she helps us win the state championship, are you okay with that?" And the kid I love the look on his face, because yeah, okay, good. And when LBGT rights and everything goes, well, what would you do if a gay kid wanted to play? I said, well, I don't know how necessarily. How would I know, and why would I care? If he helps us win the state championship, be okay with that? And I got the same look 20 years apart. And so that's what we try and teach. We talk about it in a broad umbrella of character, but it's really humanity. And that's what we teach.
I love everything that these two coaches shared, and I hope that you did too. Check your screen for a link to a podcast for parents who are raising athletes, which is conveniently called Raising Athletes. This will be a wonderful resource for you. The words that come to mind when thinking of Pam Dunn are leadership, listening, compassion, and grace. I have often said, and I will continue to say, that Pam deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that she does and the impact of her work in people's lives, including mine. She is the CEO of Your Infinite Life Training and Coaching Company, as well as the founder of the Peaceful Project. Pam is talking today about self-care. She's taking it way beyond a cup of tea or a bubble bath. In her talk, A Cup of Tea Isn't Enough, Embracing the 4 Pillars of Self-Care. Please welcome Pam Dunn.
Thank you so much, Maggie. That was an amazing introduction. And thank you to all the other speakers. I've enjoyed them so much and took so many notes. So I'm going to start out by saying a good way to take care of yourself is to find a Maggie in your life and to listen to those other speakers. And I also have some tips as well. So given all that has occurred since March of 2020, 17 months ago, we are experiencing stressors that we have not experienced before. So doesn't it make sense that if you haven't already reached a stress threshold, that you will soon? Because we're immersed in it, and so is everyone else, we will tend to be dismissive, and we could even be overly dramatic about what's going on. Either way, though, that's not dealing with what we need to deal with in order to expand our threshold. And I'm going to tell you that there is no scented candle or cup of tea in the world that will make your burnout or your stress go away in a sustainable way. A symptom also, so that all of you are aware of reaching your threshold, is going to be stress, feeling that sense of stress. It's going to be worry, anxiousness, panic attacks, irritability, trying to control everything, so much more. All of those symptoms exacerbate the problem and then distort our reality. We must be aware of these and never let the discouragement take the lead. And it also doesn't mean that you need to suck it up better or fall into resignation. Those are also coping skills. These unprecedented times call for unprecedented self-care. Not the self-care of a spa day, a bubble bath, candy, or a bottle of wine. Self-care that is nourishing and gives us room to expand our threshold, because that's what we must do. In my coaching, I found that I needed not only to develop these nuanced ways of taking care of myself, for myself, I also needed to investigate and find these for my clients, a new way to serve. Because when people feel better, they do better. And sometimes we don't have those types of answers until we need them. And this was a time, and is still a time, that we need them. So I say, begin to look at self-care from a holistic approach, taking care of yourself mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. So let me explain them, and then I'll go into detail. And by the way, please download your program notes, because all of these tips are in there. Okay, so mental self-care means that that's about how your thinking affects your well-being. Emotional self-care is how your feelings affect your well-being. Spiritual is how your beliefs affect your well-being. And then finally, physical is simply and profoundly radical self-love of your body. And that's going to be through rest, food, and movement. And I'm going to talk about that. So here are the answers to these questions about how to take care of yourself from a holistic approach. And I'm going to start with mental self-care and just read just a little excerpt from something called The Wolves Within by David Griffith. A young boy asked his grandfather, "It is as if there are two wolves inside me. One is good and does no harm. He lives in harmony with those around him and does not take offense when no offense was intended. He will only fight when it is right to do so and without discouraging others. He seems confident and in charge of his life. But the other wolf, he is full of anger. The littlest thing will set him into a fit of temper. He fights and discourages. He cannot think clearly because of his anger. He constantly reminds me how I'm not doing it well or correctly or not doing enough. It is hard to live with these two wolves inside me, for both of them try to dominate my spirit." Well, the boy looked intently into his grandfather's eyes and asked, "Which one wins, grandfather?" The grandfather solemnly answered, "The one I feed." So you see, mental self-care, I want you to know, we have 50 to 75,000 thoughts in a day. It is impossible to try and control your thinking. And so it's important not to glorify your thinking either, but rather learn how to start letting it go. I also say, don't turn around a negative thought. Don't substitute a negative or discouraging thought. Just let it go. It's just a thought. If you begin to see it like that, I promise you, you're not going to run out of thoughts. There'll be lots. The other thing that's important about this is that wisdom that knows how to take care of ourselves and knows what we need comes from a deep place inside of you and not from your intellect. It doesn't come from your thinking. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself spiritually. because your mental self-care will be easier and graceful. And that's why I mean it's a holistic approach. You want to understand each concept, and we'll go over those. So hopefully you're beginning to see that those bubble baths, that wine, that good cup of tea, all of those, you're trying to free your mind. Isn't it true that during a bubble bath for just maybe a short period of time, you stop thinking about what you're stressed about? So how about taking on mental self-care as a holistic approach and focus on freeing your mind, even without the cup of tea, even during a stressful moment? Okay, so next is emotional self-care. This is my favorite and my wheelhouse, and that is understanding feelings. Feelings are an inside-out process. So, for example, the stress isn't what is making you feel a certain way. You're causing, or those feelings are occurring because of your thoughts about the stress. So I like to talk about feelings from the perspective of this slide that I'm showing you. We have 5 basic feelings: mad, sad, afraid, hurt, and happy. Every other feeling is a derivative of one of those. If you're frustrated, you could be mad. If you're anxious, it could be afraid. So the important part is that no feeling is good or bad, right or wrong. They all have a purpose. So when you learn to understand that feelings are energy, or as a quote I have heard, feelings are visitors, they come and go. So let's make sure they don't wear out their welcome by keeping them around too long. So it's really important to let those feelings move through and out. And again, this slide here is in your download. So the thing that I said earlier about feelings have a purpose, this is what this document is. So if you let yourself feel mad all the way through and out, rather than feeling the stress of mad, if you just let that feeling move, this feeling on the other side is the inner strength that allows you to ask for what you want, to know what you want, to set boundaries, to say no when you mean no. Very important. Sad, as Micah talked about earlier in her conversation about grief, this is really important because sad lets you know, number one, that you care, and also what you care about. Afraid, I think that this is important, and definitely Dr. Lisa D'Amour is an expert on the concepts of anxiety. But also what happens in afraid is that courage is born. When we feel afraid and we let ourselves experience that, courage is born, and then our inner wisdom can tell us and show us and guide us on what we want to do next. The feeling of hurt, that feeling is challenging at times, because when we feel hurt by somebody we care about or by certain situations, we often want to go to the other person or situation and make sure that that never happens again. However, you don't want to skip the part that says that you're listening and acknowledging and affirming your own hurt. Because when you do that, you are saying, I love you to you. So remember that also happy isn't something that is the only good feeling. Happy lets you know that gratitude, appreciation, joy reside within you. And you can experience that whenever you choose. So feelings are an important thing that you allow yourself to learn how to manage and learn to understand. So are you engaging in the feeling of your thinking? That's a good thing to understand, and then let that feeling move through. I love what Morgan said about having somebody to witness and hold space for you. I love what Dr. Lisa D'Amour talked about understanding and managing anxiety. Those are all important ways to take care of yourself emotionally. Sometimes it's not emotional self-care to run from what you're feeling and to use a bubble bath as an excuse. Self-care means you move through something. Okay, so now let's talk about spiritual self-care. This is your beliefs. And often different things that occur with stressors really flush out or expose those limiting beliefs. And spiritual self-care is also about something, thinking about and focusing on something greater or bigger than you, like love. What would love do? And many of us have, take care of ourselves spiritually through our religion, through our spirituality. But I'm going to focus on beliefs. And the first thing that I always use and find the most helpful is the I am statement. This is an opportunity to take a character trait and say that character trait to yourself. So one of the things I'll do is ask myself, what do I need from the I am statement? And sometimes it's for me to say to myself, I am doing a great job, even when it doesn't feel that way. And if I'm having a challenging day, I can say that over and over again. And you know what happens? I start looking for where I am doing a great job rather than focusing on what isn't going well. And sometimes what I'm thinking, remember, keep that in mind, what I'm thinking isn't accurate. So the I am statement, listen to yourself talk, beating yourself up. That's not self-care. Comparing. If you're comparing yourself to somebody else, you may be diminishing your self-care. Don't ask questions like, why am I not doing better? Why am I not doing enough? Why is it going this way? Why is this taking so long? You see, that keeps us in the spiral of why the problem is what it is. Use the I am statement to help take yourself out of that, or ask, what do I need? How will I get there? One of my favorite suggestions is every morning, tell yourself 3 things you love about yourself. And in the evening, 3 things you appreciate about yourself that you did that day. Surrender to what you want and let go of everything in the way. And now let's talk about physical self-care. Because honestly, this is about loving your body radically, because this is the house you live in to express yourself. So feed it well, move it, get rest regularly. Now, small measures, because sometimes we can't accomplish all of that, but paying attention to small measures make big changes. I love James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. And he says, we don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to the level of our system. So make sure you have a good system in place, a system that allows you to rest, to move your body, to feed it in a way that is helpful and encouraging and sustaining to you. And begin to see yourself as someone who does that. I used to live from the perspective, without realizing it, by the way, that I was somebody who pushed my body to limits that it didn't deserve, to not get the rest I needed because that meant something better about me. But as they tell you in the airplane, it is important to put your own mask on before someone else. So you can simultaneously take care of yourself and take care of others. Be in charge. rather than in control. And that means taking action on what you can do. And another thing is support. When you're feeling stressed or at your threshold, get support from someone that will help you move out of the stress, not validate the stress. And always, and in all ways, remind yourself that you can handle whatever occurs. You always have, and you always will. So let me end with another favorite story. It's called The Trouble Tree. I hired a plumber to help me restore an old farmhouse. And after he had just finished a rough first day on the job, a flat tire made him lose an hour of work, his electric drill quit, and his ancient 1-ton truck refused to start. While I drove him home, he sat in stony silence. On arriving, he invited me in to meet his family. As we walked toward the front door, he paused briefly at a small tree, touching the tips of the branches with both hands. When opening the door, he underwent an amazing transformation. His face was wrapped in smiles, and he hugged his 2 small children and gave his wife a kiss. Afterward, he walked me to the car. We passed the tree, and my curiosity got the better of me. I asked him about what I had seen him do earlier. "Oh, that's my trouble tree," he replied. "I know I can't help having troubles on the job, but one thing's for sure. Those troubles don't belong in the house with my wife and the children. So I just hang them up on the tree every night when I come home and ask God to take care of them. Then in the morning, I pick them up again." Funny thing, he smiled, when I come out in the morning and pick them up, there aren't nearly as many as I remember hanging the night before. So let your self-care be that tree. Make the assessment in the moment, or be proactive about taking care of yourself mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And at www.yourinfinitelifeonline.com, we have lots of options of how to take care of yourself, anywhere from coaching to courses. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity, Maggie.
Thank you so very much, Pam. You've wrapped up our day by bringing us home to ourselves and the immense importance and value for caring for our spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental selves. It's through our guide that our children learn to take care of themselves. Thank you one and all for being here today. Thank you to our speakers, our hosts, and our sponsors. I sincerely hope that you took away some major nuggets that will support you and your family. Please feel free to get in touch and stay in touch. Our hosts and speakers all have vibrant websites with blogs, podcasts, and newsletters that can continue to create a community that we started today and to support you from now on. Thanks again for taking time out of your day. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.